Hi, everybody. So, this is episode 7, part 55 on TikTok, and part 12 on YouTube. So, just as a reminder, I'm making these videos so that us born and raised outside of the island can better understand our history, our culture, and who we are as a people. This episode is going to be a bit different because we're actually going to cover a court case. And this court case was the first ever to feature Native Americans as witnesses. So I'll be sharing with you the different groups of people, the witnesses from the prosecutor, the witnesses brought on by the defense, and I will be making sure that we follow along as best as possible because the case is a bit lengthy, so I will be covering all of their testimonies, but concentrating mostly on what they tell us about the indigenous lives at the time. So let me give you some necessary context. The War of Higüey ended in 1504. Nicolás de Ovando is still governor at the time. After all the massacres and killings that he ordered, what he has done has made it all the way back to Spain, to the ears of the queen. And even though she died, as well as Colón, her husband takes on her cause because she didn't want the indigenous people to be mistreated. She passed several laws trying to protect them because she declared that they were free vassals or subjects of the crown. However, she also allowed certain other rules to be passed that contradicted this. She also said that they could be taken on as slaves if they refused any aspect of Spanish conquest. So this causes tons of confusion among the settlers because they have to determine on their own, without a lot of oversight, if certain people can be taken as slaves or if they're free. So the most devastating news that they hear is that the indigenous population is declining. That means disaster for the settlement. So in April of 1508, La Junta de Procuradores de la Española gathers together in Burgos, in España. And their main purpose is to discuss how to resolve the declining population. In the Golden Book of Dominican History, called Repartimientos y Encomiendas de 1514 by the author Luis Arranz, explains that this meeting was more for show because nothing came out of it. The resolution never came for this problem. And this very case that we're going to cover shows how the system just continued on. They really didn't care. In reality, it was this same system, el sistema de la encomienda, that ended up killing these two people, GUAYABAX and FRANCISQUITO. In this same meeting held by La Junta de Procuradores, they decided that Ovando was not doing what he needed to do in order to maintain the settlement. They decided to kick him out without telling him, and they put in his place a Diego Colón, the son of Cristobal Colón. When Colón, the navigator, left to fulfill the contract that he had signed with the king and queen of Spain, he had left his two young sons, Diego and Fernando, at the Spanish court in 1492. By 1497, Diego and his brother were now personal pages to Queen Isabella. They even became members of her personal bodyguard. So even when the queen died, Diego and Fernando retained the favor of the crown. So much so that Diego ended up marrying the cousin of Rey Fernando, Maria de Toledo. This marriage secured his influence both socially and politically. So when this meeting happened in April 1508, Diego was considered the best candidate to replace Fray Nicolás de Ovando. So imagine the pure shock that Ovando felt when, on July 9th, 1509, Diego Colón and María de Toledo disembarked in el puerto de Santo Domingo. Diego brought a letter from the king himself to Ovando, and in the letter, the king expressed how unhappy he was with him. Ovando is forced to leave the island, leaving behind his palace, his riches, his lands, and his slaves. So he had to go back and give account of his behavior before the king. And part of what possibly could have stirred the pot against him was that one of the settlers, called Cristobal de Tapia had filed a lawsuit against him in 1508. So Diego immediately falls into power and begins a campaign against the settlers who have reportedly abused the natives in their quote-unquote care. And Diego is not unfamiliar with the natives. In 1493, when his father returned from the first trip, we know of 6 indigenous boys who ended up living at the court with Diego and his brother. We know that about 2 or 3 of them ended up surviving the entire time that they were there. As we have discussed before, Colón ended up adopting one of the indigenous boys and naming him after his son, El Indio Diego Colón. So Diego ate with him, lived with him, probably let him borrow some of his clothes. He got to know this indigenous boy very well. But it's obvious that this interaction with the indigenous people before even coming to the island did nothing for his heart. He continued to want and desire conquest, and his policies showed that. So on the island, Diego demanded full accounts of all of the settlers as to their behavior towards the natives. And he then heard of a particular settler named Francisco de Solis. From my understanding, this settler had arrived on the island about 1499. And right now, we're in 1509. So he had been there around 10 years. Francisco de Solis was el alcalde ordinario de la Villa de Santiago. He had also gained much wealth during his time on the island, having una hacienda called La Esperanza. We know he had several indigenous people under his command, given to him personally by Nicolás de Ovando. Many think that it was this association with Nicolás de Ovando that made Solis the perfect target of Diego Colón's new administration. I know that the background information is long, but all of it is necessary so we can understand what exactly was going on. Next, I'll be covering the different parts of the witnesses that we have so that we can better understand what the actual case covered.